All right. So, hi, I'm Jess, author of forthcoming YA novel Wings of Ebony, about a Black teen from the inner city who discovers she's half goddess and must tap into her ancestors' magic to protect her community from violence and crime. It's out with Simon and Schuster February 23rd. And there's a picture of the book cover right there on the screen. I also have a middle grade series about Park Row Magic Academy, an inner city magic school hidden in the back of a beauty salon. And that one is out in 2022. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to dive right in and I'm going to talk a bit in the beginning, but if you guys want to chime in or if you have anything to say, I will kind of pose questions so you can answer those aloud or on your own, but I am going to mention things that I want you guys to be thinking about as we go through this, mainly to make sure you're not falling asleep over there, but hopefully so that you walk away with a few good nuggets. So first off, hi, like I said, I'm J Elle. My slides are minimizing 1 second. Okay. Okay, it wants to stay like this. That's fine with me if that's fine with you guys. Actually, okay, I know that's good. Okay, so you can find me on Twitter and Instagram. I have a Facebook, but it's where my grandma hangs out, so I'm not usually there. But if you're on there, hey, ping me and follow me on social media. The first thing I want to tell you, which is a bit out of the box, and I'll tell you a little bit more about me personally, but the first thing that I want to tell you is that everyone's a writer, literally everyone. So if you typed a sentence in your life, you're a writer. I know you've written papers for your teacher, you're a writer. You're an author in your own right, the author of your own story. So like who has an Instagram, for example? Okay, so I can't see you raising your hands, but I imagine several of you are. And that's one place that you're curating your story. So my stories might seem a little bit longer and be bound to a spine, but you and I are no different. That's the first thing. And here's some proof that everyone's a writer. Here's the proof right here. Here's my proof. So my proof is I'm a mom of 3 little people, a really handsome dog named Maximus Longfellow, who would love to greet you, but I haven't figured out a way to make that possible on screen. Let's see. I make beds every day. I go to the library. I drive through my favorite fast food restaurant at midnight. Just a regular old person. I was a wedding photographer in a former life. So I'm just a regular person, and I'm also a writer. And so the first nugget for you to write down if you're taking notes is everyone's a writer. And if that sort of grinds against you personally, like, oh, I'm not a writer yet, I aspire to be, I'm gonna challenge you to push against that a little bit, because my number one piece of advice is just to get out of your head a little bit, step back and realize that you too are a writer, which might sound like it goes without saying, but it really doesn't. I'm just trying to navigate back to, why don't we minimize my face? Okay. Um, it might sound like it goes without saying, but it really doesn't. So the first thing I really want to leave with you and start with when we talk about going from an idea to a story is get out of your head. Don't psych yourself out at the task at hand. You are a writer. You're probably like, but wait, isn't that where the story inspiration is, like in my head? Well, yes. So you do want to be in your head, but you want to sort of get out of your head. So listen, when you stare at the task of writing a book or writing a story, the idea can feel, let's see what SAT words I have in my pocket, insurmountable, daunting, overwhelming. So, I mean, when my teacher used to say a 2-page paper, I would literally feel sick to my stomach. But like, hear me, the hardest obstacle you'll face doing almost anything is first believing that you can do it. And that sounds super, super basic, but don't minimize this. You are a writer too. It takes authors, it took me years to really be able to wrap my lips around those words and say them and believe them and do them. And so I'm just kicking this off with pushing you to realize that you too are a writer. If you want to be a writer, you are a writer. You're curating your story every single day, be it on Instagram or on in a notebook or on a blog, like you, or even just in your head, like you are a writer. Okay. So onto a little bit more tangible items. And I am gonna go a little quickly, but this will be recorded so you can go through and rewatch. You can always reach out to me on social media, or you can reach out to me on my website, which is wingsofebony.com. If you have any clarification questions, I'd love working with teen writers. And so if there's anything that you're trying to do and you feel stuck, do not hesitate to reach out. So now that we've established that we're on the same page, we're all writers in here, you can roll up your sleeves and let me just check my video. Am I still good on sound? Okay, perfect. Just double checking. Okay, so now that we're on the same page, we can roll up our sleeves a bit and get started. Okay, we're going to talk about pre-work. So this is the stuff you do before you write a word, and it makes a huge difference. Don't minimize pre-work. The first time I wrote a story, I just dove right in, which is great. I mean, that's a very explorative process, and if that's part of what you need to do, by all means. We're going to talk about how everyone's process is different, but don't minimize the work that you can do before you actually start writing a story or writing down some semblance of chapters. The pre-work matters. So write that down if you're taking notes. Pre-work matters. And pre-work isn't what it sounds like necessarily. So I'm sure your teacher's giving you worksheets and like character maps and all of these wonderful things that you can do. But what I want to talk about is a little bit more nuanced. And it's some of the things that we don't often practice, maybe in the classroom, but it's something that I'm going to share is like my secret weapon for crafting stories. Okay. So pre-work varies person to person. My process isn't going to look like your process, and your process isn't going to look like somebody else's process. My process is a little bit like that scene from Spider-Verse where Miles is trying to figure out why he's sticking to things, and he ends up walking past a window of some lady's classroom with like no shirt on and that bird pecking at him. I'm all over the place when I write, and that's just part of my process. I've learned, I used to fight that in the beginning. Like I felt like my thoughts were all over the place. My ideas were hard to rein in. I had this idea, and then what if the character did this, and then what if they did that, and is that too complicated? My brain was all over the place, and I thought that was a bad thing in the beginning. And I'm letting you know that if that's part of your process, that's okay. There isn't one process that's right or wrong. That's the beauty of creativity. So like in math, it's order of operations. In science class, it's follow these rules, do this experiment. There are formulaic steps everywhere. And what I love about art, because writing is art, is you curate those steps yourself, tailored to what works best for you. So I can't give you a handbook, unfortunately. I can't say, hey, follow these 5 steps and you'll churn out the best story ever written. It doesn't exist. It doesn't work like that. But breathe easy, okay? Because it doesn't exist, and that's good news. That means that you are free to create. So thank goodness there is no rule book. So for my friends out there that are looking for, what are my 5 steps that I follow to write a New York Times bestseller? I do not have it for you, my friends. That's just not how the creative process works, which is good news. As you practice writing, because writing does take practice like anything else, if you're an athlete and you think about how many times you go to practice before you actually, like if you're a track athlete, how many times you go to practice before you actually go to a track meet. Writing takes practice just like that, and refining it. And like a muscle, the more you do it, it gets easier and easier. So processes, steps, habits that seem to make you feel excited. So if there's a certain thing you do that gets you in the mood for writing, or if there's a place that you sort of nestle away at your house, or a certain book that you read, or a window that you like to stare out of that gets the writing wheels turning in your brain, take note of those things, because that's part of your process. It's not just random, it's important, and it's critical to give your brain that space to be inspired. So pay attention to the things that work for your process to get in that creative space. For me, it's creating aesthetics. So basically, I like going to Pinterest and making these 9-tiled collages of just like inspiration. This is one for the sequel to my debut. And before I started writing, I had so many ideas of what to put in the story. And I wanted to get an idea of what the tone and vibe of the story was. How sweet did I want it to be? How gritty did I want it to be? And how like majestic and dark did I want it to be? And so I went to Pinterest, and here's an example of what I do as part of my process. For an author friend of mine, it's rereading some of her favorite books in a particular genre, getting lost in those pages. Figure out what gets your idea wheels turning. And every time you want to try writing it out, plug into that process. Because, you know, and I don't know if this is talked about often enough, but a lot of writing happens in your head before a word ever hits the page, which is why the first thing I have here under define your process is daydreaming required. Who's been camping? Has anybody been camping? I can't see you raising your hands, but if you've ever been camping or you've ever started a fire from scratch, what was it like? Anybody want to chime in? We can turn on mics. Well, if you've seen a fire started from scratch, a story is very much like that. And in its idea form, it's very small and it needs nurturing. Fires need to breathe, they need oxygen to grow. And the same with your idea. It needs to breathe and it'll grow into a fully formed concept for a book. Let your ideas sprout legs in your brain. So the second you get them, you can write in a fury, and that's great to get the ideas out. But you can also think about it, create some 9-tiled collages, read other books that are similar to the one that you're thinking about creating. Let that idea grow. That's the first step in your process. So that was a lot, right? That was a lot that I talked about really, really quickly. Believing you're a writer and defining your process. So I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions at all before we jump into the next thing. I'm also going to take a sip of water because, woo, that was a lot of talking. Okay, so the next thing, let me go back. Click. There we go. The next thing we're going to talk about, and this is more of the meat. So for you note takers out there, you're going to love this part. The next thing we need to figure out is our story core. But first, I have 2 reminders for you, and we're going to write these down. Number 1, respect the process of creation. And number 2, don't aim for perfection. It's not even, just don't even stress yourself out about that. It's not even a thing. Okay. These go hand in hand and they're super simple. All right. So for example, who's ever cooked before or baked? Who's made anything? Okay. I can't see you raising your hand, but I know some of you are in the kitchen helping the parents cook up some food sometimes. So I know you know what I'm talking about. Writing is a process just like cooking. Okay. So you start with eggs and flour and sugar, and you can make that into something really yummy. You can make it into cupcakes or cake, but it takes time. Going back to those ingredients again and again and doing things to them is what makes it delicious. Beating the eggs, folding in the chocolate chips, sifting in the flour. So going into writing your story, understand that the first iteration of whatever comes out will need you to beat it a little more, mix in some sugar, sprinkle a little bit more flour. It's going to need work. The goal of the first draft, can anybody guess what the goal of the first draft of a story is? Think about that. Take a guess in your head, even if you don't want to say anything out loud.
Is it just to lay everything out and see what works and what doesn't?
That is very much it. The goal, and I want you to write this down, the goal is to simply exist. That's it. That's the entire goal, just so that it is a thing. If you made your first draft a theme, pat yourself on the back because you did it. Just write it, then fix it up. Aiming for perfection in that first draft, which is something that many authors struggle with, myself included. So I am preaching to myself here. Aiming for perfection will get you nowhere. Just do your best, as cliche as that sounds, do your best. The real work comes when you go back to your finished first draft and you start fixing it up. Every author's first draft is junk. What's one of the favorite authors you've ever read? Think of their name, think of their book. Remember all of the ways you loved it. I guarantee you their first draft was not that version you read. Wings of Ebony is draft 17 of my story. 17. That's 16 more than the first draft. It takes time, and that's part of the process. Remember earlier when we said respect the process. Don't expect final level results on first draft tries. I'll say that again because that's really important. And that's important in a bunch of different disciplines, not just writing. Don't expect final level results on first draft tries. Okay, so we've daydreamed, we've made a playlist of the vibe we want our book to have, we've made collages of inspiring images, we've reread our favorite books, we're actually ready to type something. But now what you'll notice is that what was an idea has sprouted deeper roots. It's taken on more form. The more you've thought about it, and the more you've thought about it, and the goal of step 3 is to give that form some structure. We need to figure out our story core. So step 3, write this down, is setting the bones in place. Okay, so who's broken a limb? An arm, a leg? Hopefully, I mean, those are really painful. An ankle, a finger will go smaller. I don't want to traumatize anyone by remembering those injuries. So if you've broken a leg or you've broken an arm or you know someone who has, you understand that when the doctor, my sound is coming in funny. Can you still hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So when the doctor goes to put it back together, they have to kind of set it in place so that it grows back properly. So when you think about the first draft of your story and getting ready to write, it's like setting bones in place. The more you do in advance with these core pieces of your story, the more cohesive your story draft will be. So let's go through the letters. And I always like to guess, what does the C stand for? So any guesses what the C stands for before we click it? Okay, let's see. C, character with a problem. Every story has a character at the center who has some sort of problem. What was Harry's problem in Harry Potter? What was Katniss's problem in the Hunger Games? When you think about your story that you want to write, your idea that sprouted legs, who is your character? What is their problem? Anyone want to share something they've read recently and what the problem that character faced? No pressure. You don't want to speak out. But as you go through this, I want you to be thinking about things you've read, movies you've seen. The character has a problem, and that's generally how the story kicks off. Okay, so I feel like I can click that arrow, but I keep clicking the little house button. Okay, so now that we know our character has a story, the next thing we want, any guesses on the O? Now you want to put an obstacle in your character's way of fixing their problem. What was Katniss's obstacle? The Hunger Games. The whole game was their obstacle. Think about that story or favorite movie. What was their obstacle? Okay, I'm gonna try this little arrow button. Let's hope it doesn't do anything terrible. Oh, see, look, it worked. All right, R, raise the stakes. Any guesses what stakes are? It wasn't a term that I really heard until I started writing professionally. I understood it implicitly, but I didn't understand it like by definition. But when you think about stakes, stakes are crucial to a story. And basically it answers the question, what happens if your character doesn't fix the problem? If nothing happens, then we have no compelling reason for the character to take action. So instead of entering the Hunger Games, Katniss could have gone to get a hot dog and called it a day. There were no stakes. Nothing would happen to her sister if she didn't enter. So she's gonna go home and catch reruns of her favorite show. She's good. If there's nothing on the line, we have no story. So decide what your characters risk by failing. It doesn't always have to be the end of the world. You know, that's a popular trope those are popular stakes in young adult, especially. But if you're working on middle grade, for example, your protagonist could be forced to public speak in front of the whole school. That could be gripping enough consequences if she fails. So that then the character wants to work hard to avoid those consequences. Losing a friend could also be strong enough stakes. Pick something true to your story, true to your character. And E, the end of your book. End with proof of character change. This is really important. So you remember in the beginning, Your character had a problem. Well, there was a reason they didn't just fix that problem with the snap of a fingers. There was something they had to go through the rest of the story to change. And that change needs to be evidenced in how they behave in the end of the story. So whatever your character does to end the story should tap into something inside them or outside them that they didn't have access to in the open of the book. It should be proof that they have grown some. Now, they don't need to be night and day different. They can be, or they could just be a little bit more confident, a little bit more trusting. You know, there should be evidence on the page based on how the character is behaving in the end of the story versus the beginning of the story, that something in their life has changed them. And those are the core points of your structure. So you have your idea, you've dreamt about it, you let it breathe, it's got legs, you're ready to write. The next thing you do is you try to figure out these core pieces of your book, of your story, and you just jot down notes for each of them. And now, my friends, you are ready to write your book. Now, there's one more piece of outlining that I recommend. It is optional, but I swear by it. Okay. And it is mapping your beats. So beats are a fancy word for what order things should happen in a story. So I'm sure in your classes, I'm sure in your classes you've talked about like plot and climax, and I'm visual. So let's look at this little picture here. See how this is your story, start to finish. So it continues to rise, and then it declines after 3 to the ending, okay? So we're gonna dig into that just a little bit. And I don't wanna get too didactic here because I want you to continue thinking sort of pulled back from your story, because if you're in the idea phase, sometimes thinking about this part can be a little daunting. So I don't wanna sit on this too long, but I do wanna give you some tools here that I love that might be helpful to you. So in The Lion King, what if Mufasa died in the first couple minutes, like the first couple pages? How would that have changed the impact of the story? Okay, or asked another way, how did seeing Simba and his dad's relationship before he died set us up for his death? It made us love them together. Then it snatched him away. The order of those things was critical to get the intended effect of us sympathizing with Simba. So one way you can figure out what order things should happen in your story is to use beats. Now, this can be really in-depth, but again, I'm going to give you the cheater version, so it'll be our secret. There is also a book on this that you can read by Jessica Brody, which is brilliant, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So the first thing is you want to think of your story in 4 pieces, each with its own mini climax. Are any of you musicians? Do any of you play an instrument? What's a crescendo? Do we know what that is? A crescendo. Guess. So a crescendo is the loudest point reached by gradually increasing sound. So imagine each part of your story, these little chunks here, second chunk, third chunk, fourth chunk. Imagine each part of your story building to what I'm going to call a loudest point. Now, if you're taking notes, this is what you want to write down, okay? Each act is going to have what I call a loudest point, and that's what it's building to, okay? So let's see what Act 1's loudest point is. Act 1 loudest point is the very end of the act, and it ends on the character having to make a decision. And making that decision will change them forever in some way. They don't know how, but it will change them forever. They can't go back. For Katniss, it's her sister's name being pulled out of the bowl, so she volunteers for the Hunger Games. Spoiler alert, sorry. I assume everybody's seen that at this point, or at least heard of it. So your loudest point at the end of Act 1 is the character has to act. Katniss has to do something. So figuring out in your story, what does my character have to do in Act 1, the very end? And the rest of Act 1, remember, is building to that point, showing the reader how they're getting to that point. Okay, Act 2, loudest point. The character has been chasing their goal, whatever it is they're after, trying to fix the wrong way. And at the loudest point, end of Act 1, the middle of the book, roughly, something happens that forces them to start chasing that goal the right way. In the Hunger Games, Katniss was just trying to get away, trying to avoid the conflict, not really trying to take anybody out. She was just trying to get through. And then in the middle of the book, she switched to, I'm going to actually aim to win the games cleverly. So she, instead of just reacting, she became more active after the middle of the book, after that loudest point in Act 2. So you have to figure out, how do I build to this loudest point? And what's going to happen at the end of Act 2 to change my character from just sort of chasing their goal the wrong way to chasing it the right way? Okay. Act 3. Now, this is my favorite act in a book. At the 75% mark of a book or a movie or show, something typically happens almost all the time. The loudest point is unique in the third act because it ends on a huge failure after a big climactic moment, okay? So this is at the point where it looks like your character's done for. So in the action movies, it's when the bad guy's winning and he punches him one more time and he's not getting up. Oh my goodness, he's not gonna get up and he's bleeding. And oh my gosh, that's that moment, right? You're like, oh my gosh, please get up. Don't give up, please, please. And then he gets up, right? So the end of Act 3 is that moment where it looks like your character is done for. They're going to give up. Everything's gone wrong. The evil genius is winning, blase, blase, right? It feels like they've hit rock bottom. If you're doing a quieter story where it's not a big fight scene, you could be like in the middle grade example where someone has to, where the character has to get on stage in front of everyone. And that's the thing she's trying to avoid. At the darkest moment, it could look like everything she's tried failed and she actually gets on stage and it goes terrible and she's just absolutely mortified. And it's like, oh my goodness, her confidence and her self-esteem is like irreparable, and this poor character. So it's that moment that feels like all is lost, okay? That's the end of Act 3. And then the very end, click, click, there we go, is the character getting up. It's the moment when that final punch didn't do them in, when they find some reserve energy, or when they have a talk with grandma and grandma says the words that they need to hear and they realize, I'm not as shy as I thought I was. I'm more capable than I thought I was. I'm stronger than I had assumed I was. Or getting on stage really wasn't that bad. It's that moment where your character gives it one last push, and this time they win, assuming that's how you want the book to end. It's that one more big try. And so the loudest moment is the end of the book where you wrap up things and you show us proof of how your character is different than they were at the beginning. And that is my core method shoved into 4-act beats, which is inspired by Save the Cat, which is the outlining system that I use, which is just a brilliant book by Jessica Brody. So pick it up from the library. You can also find it obviously anywhere books are sold, but it is amazing. Like if you own the copy, don't hesitate to write in it and really use it. It's a book, like my pages are very worn, the binding's coming off, like I use it all the time. So, I mean, that's the essence of taking your idea to a story, to something you can actually put down on paper and get through the draft. And so you're ready to write. It's like writing little 4 mini stories in one almost. You'll want to take breaks when you're writing. Don't feel like you need to sit down and write a whole story at once. Revisit your inspiration. You could be in the middle of the second act and just hit a lull where you're like, I don't know what to write today. Go back to your playlist. Go back to that window. Go back to that book you love to read. Go back to your inspiration and fill that creative tank again. And remember, don't aim for perfection. You'll drive yourself bonkers. Just get some words down and let the story flow. Everyone's a writer and you have a story to tell. And I want to read it, so you got to write it. And that's all I have for you guys today. If you want to ask questions or anything like that. I hope that didn't run too long.
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
When you're writing a draft, do you recommend having other people read your drafts, or do you think that we should hold it back and, you know, work on it some more before having somebody have an input on it?
So sharing your work is for me, such a scary process, right? Because it's like you pour yourself into this art and you're sending it to someone, and like in your mind, you're like, please just like it, please just like it. But really what you really want is you want them to tell you because you know, you're this close to it. Okay. So you can't see its flaws. You want someone to tell you, the ways that you could improve it and make it stronger. So what I say is it depends. It depends on if you're ready for that feedback. In general, sharing your work is very, very helpful. More eyes on a story helps the story, because at a certain point in writing, when you're super close to it, you can't see the way it falls short, especially when you read it a bunch. I mean, at one point I was reading my story so many times, I wasn't even reading the words on the page. I was just kind of like reading from memory. And I was not reading what was happening. Like, my friend was like, did you see that da happened? And I was like, wait, where did that happen? I just read this, but I was so close to it that I was blinded by its flaws. And so in that regard, it's very helpful to have critique partners, beta readers read your story. If you're pursuing traditional publishing or even self-publishing, there will be an editor usually that you work with, and that person is also another set of eyes in your story that's going to give you that bird's eye view that you are too close to the story to see. So collaboratively, you can work together and make it better. Now, when in the process you do that is really up to you and your comfort level, because if you're just trying to get the words out, sometimes it can be hard to get feedback when you haven't even sort of gotten comfortable in the story yet. So if you get feedback too early, when you're just trying to get it out, it can feel stifling. It can almost stop. For some of my friends, like, they can't get feedback until after they finish the second draft, because in the first draft process, if they hone in on all the things that are wrong, they struggle to believe they can just get the story done. And so they stop. So it's really a personal thing. I like to have alpha readers. I have two of my closest friends read for me. And they just know, like, if it's a first draft, please don't tell me my commas are in the wrong place, because I can't handle that feedback right now. Tell me what's working and tell me what you'd love to see more of. In my later drafts, I'm like, be brutal. Tell me every single thing that's wrong with it. Burn it. So it just depends on where you are in the process. But in general, yes, sharing your work feedback is really, really helpful. Any other questions?
I have another question.
Okay.
Do you recommend that we start small with our stories, or what? It doesn't matter, whatever speaks to us, we just write it out? Or do we create our magnum opus Game of Thrones, kind of like, you know?
Yes, write that. I want to read it. My recommendation is that you don't limit your creativity.
Okay.
My recommendation is that you go where you have passion and interest to write. Because when you're passionate about something and you're interested in it, it flows different than when you feel like, okay, I need to do 5 short stories before, and then 1 novella, and then, yes, and then after that, I'll do a first draft. Like, if you limit some people thrive in that sort of structure, but in general, like, if you are inspired to get your Game of Thrones story out, write it, because again, it goes back to that sort of exercising, right? Like, you need to exercise that muscle of writing, because it is something that takes practice. And if you are inspired and passionate and excited about something, that practice is not going to be painful. It's like looking forward to going to the gym, which is not something I understand at all. But I know there are people that do. I am not one of them. I aspire to be one day. But that's an example. Like, you want to be excited to get to that draft. And so it's writing from your interest first, and don't limit yourself to what that is. Any other questions? This is so fun. I love talking about this stuff. Well, and if you guys think of anything, I don't know where the video is being posted, but if there's like a comment feature, just shoot me an email and I'm happy to like jump in the comments and reply if anybody has questions.
Okay, I have a question from JP. He says, I'm basically in the first draft and I'm trying to stay on track, and it's hard because I'm a Capricorn perfectionist.
I know this. I know.
What's your advice?
One of my best friends is a Capricorn. One of my critique partners is a Capricorn. I hear you. I'm not gonna lie to you, like, that's hard. It never goes away. Like, that little perfectionist voice never goes away. With anything, I think this is just sort of my motto, like, see the good in it, but then like recognize where it limits you. So it's great that you have those instincts, because it means that you have a high standard that you set for yourself that you want to meet when you finish the story. But that said, recognize when it's stifling your ability to create. And so you sort of have to be an editor in your head and you have to be a writer. So like I like to say like my writer brain and my editor brain are not friends. Like they don't. And there are times where I am in my writing brain and I'm just like getting the words out and my editor brain's like, that's a whole mess. And I'm just like, be quiet, stop talking. And I just have to keep typing. And so I would encourage you to, if you're still in your first draft, adjust your goal to recognizing that it has to just exist. And there is something that happens magical. I'm telling you, magical. When you finish a first draft and you look at the story and you say, okay, this is a hot mess. What am I going to do? One of my favorite revision methods is Susan Dennard's. So Google Susan Dennard revision method. But again, that starts after the first draft. And it's all about figuring out what you wrote. And if you guys ever want to do another video about like revising, I'm happy to do that. But like right now, try to keep your head down. You know that that Capricorn in you is going to be such a good asset. But like right now, kind of tap them on the shoulder and tell them, to be patient because you need your writer brain to take charge and get those words out. I do, when I'm writing so I write a scene, I do go back and read it probably 6 or 7 times within a span of like 1 to 2 days. And I do tweak things here or there. And I'm constantly thinking about my story. If you've done lots of outlining, which I was a pantser for a while, which just means like I just kind of write as I go. And then I became an outliner and now I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. I will say that sometimes I love having an outline and it's the only way I write now. But sometimes having an outline made me feel a little stifled because I was trying to adhere to it so rigidly that when it wasn't working or when my characters were trying to, because your characters will speak to you, they'll start to like fight with you. You're trying to do this, but they want to do this. Sometimes the scene can kind of take on its own organic flow. And sometimes that's valid and you need to be able to go with that because sometimes that works better for tension or for pacing. And then you won't be able to figure out how that adjusts your outline until you finished it and looked at it bigger picture. So just recognize that, it's the perfectionist piece is very helpful, just not in the first phase of drafting. And I will say it gets easier. So if this is the first book you've ever written, I'm really going to challenge you to like quiet that voice. If you've written several books and you just know this is your process, then you can reread your chapters and give yourself a little bit more grace there. But because I do know like authors who specifically have to perfect each chapter before they move on. But again, finishing the first draft of the first full-size novel that you've ever written there's something magical that clicks. And so I would chase that so hard if you can. But it's going to be good. That Capricorn energy it's going to be good. Any more questions? No? Okay, cool. And again, you guys are welcome to reach out on social media. I'll bring that up again in case that's helpful. Where is it? Here we are.
Oh, thank you so much, Jess. That was very informative.
Yay, I'm so glad. I hope I didn't talk too fast, but I'm glad it's recorded.
Yes.
So that
Yeah.
students can go back through it and listen. And I'll definitely keep a link up on my website too for any teen writers perusing. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, wait, hold on a second. JP
Okay.
has another question.
Okay.
It says, I'm writing from different perspectives. What's your advice for that?
That is very impressive, by the way. Like, pat yourself on the back just for that. The first book I wrote was from 4 POVs, so I hear you. My advice, I will frame my advice with, I do a lot of mentoring writers and critiquing writers. And the thing I see most often with multi-POV early draft books is that each character isn't necessarily needed. So what I would say is challenge yourself to find out, going back to sort of that first thing that we talked about in core, the C, what is each character's problem? And is their problem unique? Or do any of the characters exist solely for the reason of telling backstory or illuminating the villain's plans? Each character needs a specific arc. They need a problem they're pursuing. And that's a lot to juggle. It can be done and done super well. So I commend you on that. Just be really intentional about making sure each character is needed in the story. A lot of times they're not, is what from what I see. It also depends on which age category you're writing. But I see a lot of times where one point of view is really the writer exploring the world through one point of view. And then there's another character who's sort of the main story, who's going through everything, who's growing, who's actively engaged in the plot. And that's really your main character. So if you want all of them to be essential, do that character work ahead of time and figure out the core for each of them. And then shape your plot around that. Does that help?
JP, do you have any more questions, or you're all set? Oh, yes, he does. I have a question for you, Jess. Do you have to specifically set a time for yourself to just sit down and do your work, or do you just go with the flow of how you're feeling and, you know?
It depends on where I'm at in life. And it depends on if I'm on deadline or if I'm just writing a book for fun.
Yeah.
Well, for fun. Like if the book has already sold and I'm on deadline and my editor's expecting it by a certain date, then I tend to be a little bit more structured. If it's a story that I would like to sell one day, then I just kind of work on it more in my free time. I do like writing on a routine though. So I find that, again, like working out, which is a really good analogy the more I think about it. Like if you're working out every morning at the same time, from what I hear, again, this is not my thing. From what I hear, your body is sort of acclimates to that. Your metabolism acclimates to that. And so it's kind of like your writing brain. I go through phases where for example, I just drafted the sequel to Wings of Ebony, the first draft of it, and it is a whole mess, but I got it done. It's 78,000 words, and I got it done in about 5.5 weeks. And it's a mess. Did I say that? But it'll be better by the time you guys get it to shelves. I promise. My editor is fantastic. So what I liked to do with that book, and it's 2020, which has been a whole thing. So I set myself up to wake up every morning and write until about lunchtime and then stop. And I found that when I tried to disrupt that process and sit down like after dinner and write, my writing brain was just like, no, I'm sorry, we're off duty right now. And then when I wake up in the morning, like the words are just there because my brain had gotten accustomed to it. So you don't have to do that, but that's just paying attention. Again, it goes back to that sort of defining your process. Like I have friends who don't write like that. Like they have to sit down and write whenever they're inspired. And sometimes it's in the middle of the night, sometimes it's in the morning, but I know me, and like my brain hooks into a habit really, really well. So I started to create the habit, and it varies per project. You know, the first draft of Wings of Ebony I wrote at night. So it was like every night after dinner, after the kids were in bed, I sat down and the words just came. So it varies.
That's very good advice. JP has another question.
Yeah.
It says, I'm writing an Afrofuturism fantasy, and I'm trying to knock off the white man on my shoulder. Kind of, do you have any tips on how I can silence his gaze?
That is a fantastic question. Tips. It's hard to, I would say this, it's hard to do when you're in the first draft or when you're trying to finish the draft. What I personally would do is I would dig into that insecurity. For me, it's an insecurity, and I struggle with this too. where I'm writing a story, and the seed of it is and again, this may be different for you, but for me, just to be very like vulnerable and transparent for a moment, I am worried that my words and their worth on their own, like paying homage to my community, my people as a Black person, like aren't enough to make it in traditional publishing. And so that worry seeps in as me wanting to put in the white gaze, like, oh, maybe this will make it appealing to them. It's not a conscious thing. It's very subconscious. And I recognize that for me, the root of it is insecurity. And I mean, quite frankly, the industry hasn't had the best track record for publishing diverse books. So, to some degree, that worry might be warranted. But what I've had to do is I had to write out my specific worries, like just put words to them, like name them. Like, I'm worried an editor is going to see this sort of slang in my book and tell me that it sounds unpolished and not worthy of tradition. Like, I had to just write out the rawest version of my worries on paper and look at them. And then when I revised, I had to go through those worries and address them in my manuscript. Like, I'm not going to correct this for this reason. So it was a very conscious experience, and a little cathartic and a little painful, because I was so bummed. I was like, I can't believe that this worry is crept into my writing so insidiously. Like, how? But for me, it did. And so I hear you. And I would say figure out what the root of that is. What is the root of that concern? Like, what is the root of that voice, of that little voice, that voice sitting on your shoulder? And spend some time sitting there to dig into that, and then go back to your manuscript and address it. I'm optimistic that the industry is changing. So if your concerns are the same as my concerns, write your truth. Write the story that you want to tell, because the world needs to hear it. So I don't know if that helps, but I empathize with you, friend.
And going on with that, Jess, do you find that, yeah, diversity in books is thankfully becoming more normal? Is there like better publishers out there that, people of color can work with?
Most of my experience is in traditional publishing. All of my experience is in traditional publishing. So I can only speak to that. And I would say, no, I think that I've seen strides from multiple publishers and multiple imprints and multiple editors, and, so at all different levels of leadership in publishing. I think as an industry, there is an increase of awareness and interest in doing better. But I can't speak for every single person involved. I don't think that there's one that's better than the other. No. I love what I'm seeing from, My House takes great care of me. Simon & Schuster is fantastic. And I've several author friends at all the houses, and I've seen great situations. I've seen not so great situations in terms of like how authors of color are being allowed to exist in their story, and the way they're allowed to craft their story. So I've seen examples all over the board. And I guess I think what's really important is that we just, as a writer, we are the first advocate for our work and the best advocate for our work. And so it's important that like we stand securely stand firmly in our understanding of what our work is worth, and what we're okay with and what we're not okay with. And just my encouragement to you, and I said this before because I've struggled with this personally, is if you're pursuing traditional publishing, do not let your desperation to make it and to get a book deal like compromise the things that are important to you, and compromise things that are valid about the story that you need to tell. And I think that we really need to work for the buck to stop with us as the writer, as the creator, as the artist. And I realize that that's hard to do when you feel like someone's sort of giving you an opportunity, but I am cautiously optimistic that publishing is making strides to better listen. And if you are getting into publishing and you want to know, if you're concerned about the advocates that you're with, plug into other writers, you know, talk to other writers. Book Twitter is huge. Like the writing community on Twitter is so huge. Like they're my extended family basically. And there's this whole, you know, you can always get in touch with someone and just say, hey, like I officially have a literary agent or an offer from a literary agent, or I officially have an offer from a publisher. Like, do you know anything about this publisher that I should be aware of? Because some of those things, a lot of those things don't necessarily make it to public forums for discussion. But if you talk to authors or fellow writers, there's a lot of information that you can get in sort of back channels. And we're very open to that because we take care of each other in this industry. We have to. So.
Thank you for that. So JP says he has no more questions. He wants to thank you, and he really appreciates your help and your answers. So I'm also thankful for you because, you know, way back when I was one of those people who wanted to write, but I just, you know, never went down to actually sit down and write because I was so discouraged, you know, and it's just, that's part of the hurdle, like your own self, you know.
It is. You're a writer. You're a writer.
Yeah.
You're a writer.
I want to try it again.
I want to read your stories. So yes. And that's why I started with that, because it's the biggest hump. Like so many people want to write books and so few do. And I think it's because I'm sure it's a layered reason, but like how much of that starts with us, like believing that we can. It was the biggest obstacle. It is still the biggest obstacle for me. And I have 5 books headed to shelves and I'm still like, can I do this? Like, what am I doing? How do you write a story? So I don't know that it ever goes away. We just kind of push through it, you know? So you're not alone.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to hear about the community at Twitter too. So yeah, it's good to have that, you know, support. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So thanks. So bye, Jess.
Bye.